Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Knights of the Alternate Table. And today we're gonna do only one episode instead of a two-parter like normally. What if the US lost the Cold War? So, if you enjoy, please hit the subscribe button and the like, and turn on that notification and leave a comment down below on what I can improve on. And yeah, it should be fun. Thank you, and have a good one. But what in our timeline would change to allow the US to collapse instead of the Soviets? Well, much as with the Soviets in Afghanistan, the US was at its lowest with the Vietnam War. And so, with the constant peace and the more and more slaughters of US troops, would eventually leave the people to start deciding against the government's action, who are sacrificing their men just to die in a pointless war. So, the peace movement against the government would break up the US more and more, with multiple sections starting to decide to leave instead of join. This would be the death of democracy as we all knew it, with all the countries having to decide for themselves if they want to follow the US or turn to the Comintern to see if they could help. But the US would dissolve its union into multiple other unions, the US would break up into multiple sections, them being Cascadia with parts of Canada, Deseret, Dakota, the Indian Territory, Texas, the CSA, the Heart of the Union, and New England, as well as Quebec would break away from Canada, as without the US, Canada would soon follow suit and follow the US example, with the death of democracy itself losing faith from all other democracies. So, with Canada gone, countries would have to choose their fate. Britain would also break up into Wales, Scotland, England, with Ireland taking North Ireland, with France and Italy leaning towards more communist countries to try and get them to join and get aid from the Soviet Union instead of being an enemy. This would obviously dissolve NATO. Meanwhile, Eastern Germany would quickly annex the Federal Republic of Germany, as it being more German, and with the death of capitalism and democracy, would be a quick transition with the fleeing German people to East Germany, under fear that soon the Republic would collapse as well, not just only the other powers in Europe collapsing all around them as well. So, with the new map looking like this, showing how all of the borders would end up turning out, as you can clearly see, a united Ireland being one of the strongest places for democracy in the entirety of Europe. As well as, I have to admit, I made a mistake by accidentally giving Corsica to Italy. I apologize for this, and you can roast me in the comments, I guess, if you want to. So, as you can see from this map, is a showing of the ideologies, with the bright red being communist, being for the Pacific states, the heartland of the Union, Quebec and New England, authoritarian being the darker red, being the CSA, blue being democracies with Texas, Deseret, and Canada, and the brown being technically independent but not really, with the Indian Territory, Dakota, and Cascadia. Meanwhile, in Europe, you can see that the Alps regions are also democratic, with most of Europe being communist, Spain being authoritarian, Britain being authoritarian, Wales being technically independent, Scotland and Ireland being democracies, as well as all Nordic countries besides Sweden being democracies, and Portugal being another hope for democracy. With New England and the Pacific states, as well as with the heartland of the Union being communist, would start putting pressure to Dakota and the Indian Territory, with Deseret and Texas trying to get them over to their sides, seeing the others as foreign invaders. They would try to remain as neutral as possible and join the winning side, as their territory was so loosely divided that they really didn't have a power to draft or get people in the army. Anyways, a war would soon break out between the Communists and the Democratic, with Canada also joining in on the Democratic side to try and see this as the last hope for democracy in the Western world. So, with Canada supporting, a surprise invasion would happen into northern Washington. Meanwhile, in Deseret, they would lose more and more land, but Canada would quickly push into Tibet and New England, as well as parts of the heartland of the Union. Meanwhile, with the Pacific states now expecting the war, would start pushing up into Canada, as well as more and more Deseret territory would be taken, as there wasn't really any defensible places with the salt flats. But more and more of the heartland of the Union would be taken, and also New York would start being under Canadian rule, as well as with more and more Quebec territory coming back into Canada. Sorry for that last clip, that was my dog if you heard the shaking and rustling. But anyways, almost all of the panhandle of Idaho would be taken, with territory being taken in Canada, and Pacific troops marching up to almost touching the Great Salt Lake. Meanwhile, Quebec would be fully capitulated, and New York and New England would be taken more and more. Meanwhile, the only reason the Pacific states and New England would be kept alive would be due to Soviet support, with the more developed Canadian Army and not the fractured, splintered one of the US Army of what remains in those territories would be only kept up through the support of the Soviets with more and more equipment, as well as with more experienced men. But slowly over time, this would start to diminish, and the Soviets would see this as a lost cause. The Pacific states would march all the way up to the Great Salt Lake, and the Heartland would lose more and more territory from the initial beachhead that was landed by Canadian forces. Almost all of Maine would be taken, as well as half of New York. New England would start to try and negotiate with Canada instead of unconditional surrender. Meanwhile, the Heartland would keep the same amount, with Little Brown getting made, but New England would almost be completely destroyed, with the capital having to be moved from New York City back down to Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, in California and the Pacific states, they would start losing land, though keeping some land in Deseret, as that was easier for them to hold with the salt flats. Michigan would almost be completely destroyed by Canada, and more of Washington would be taken, with now the Pacific states starting to lose land to the Deseret and Texans. This would therefore lead to the fact with the Pacific states now begging for New England and the heart of the Union to do whatever they can to keep this alliance strong and still have communism. Now, New England would just surrender outright, not seeing any New Deal, as well as a large majority of Michigan's troops would be trapped up in northern Michigan. Half of Washington would start to be taken, as well as with some land now actually going in to the Pacific states on the eastern front instead of just trying to hold from them, and now they would start to push back more and more. At the end of the war, the Union would just be reabsorbed, with the states that were unsure about choosing a side choosing to join, as well as Canada, seeing that the US needs to be a strong bastion of democracy, would also decide to join, putting a pin in the Soviet side once again for the rest of the 21st century. This would lead to a huge prize of patriotism. In the last 3 centuries, the US went to being the US to a disorganized US and Canada to one state. The flag would represent that. One state of the Union, as now they were united under one nation, which is why one star would be put on the flag instead of all of them, depending on each state, as now they were unified as one. Wow, what a great video. I'm really tired because it's night and I want to go to bed. So if you also want to go to bed, leave a like and a comment down below, and make sure to subscribe because alternate history is great. I love alternate history, you love alternate history, and if you don't, then subscribe anyways because I'll make you love alternate history. Just kidding, you have your freedom of choice, but seriously subscribe. Thank you and have a good one. Well, yeah, bye. Wow, that was a great video, and on your right, another great video, and on your left, a video that YouTube chose for you. And hey, guess what? You should watch them and subscribe, because yeah, that's great. Have a good one, and